My name is Niamh Moriarty. I work collaboratively with another artist, Ruth. We're presenting a body of work at Galway City Museum called A Collection of Disarticulated Bones. I've worked with Ruth collaboratively for over a decade, and a lot of our work is video, performance or text-based, and a lot of it has text is really important to the work and narrative, so the work is always about storytelling, and the storytelling often comes from the conversation between me and my collaborator, because we're always talking out the ideas and shutting down the bad ones. And this body of work in particular, we're trying to engage more voices outside of our practice. So there'll be 3 documentary videos in the installation, and each of them is an invited speaker telling their own story. They're 3 really different stories, but I'm going to tell you about one in particular because we collaborated with Niamh Moriarty, who is the curator of emigration at the National Museums of Northern Ireland. So he works predominantly in Omagh at the Ulster American Folk Park, and the Ulster American Folk Park is an open air museum that has real buildings from famine era Ireland and antebellum America. The American buildings were brought stone by stone and brick by brick across the Atlantic back to Ireland. So they're all stories of Irish emigrants. And there's one particular house with a dark history that we were interested in. It's a red brick home. So it's very unusual for that era. It's from rural Tennessee, where there wouldn't have been brick factories like there would have been in the cities. So you have Irish Catholic settlers going over from Ulster. This is the Rogan family house, so specifically an Irish Catholic emigrant family from Ulster who are building and replicating these kind of empirical colonial buildings. So they want to have a house that looks like the Dutch houses or the British houses that you would see in the big cities there. So this house is a big red brick house, and it was built using slave labour, and it's a much more laborious process than building red brick house, say, in a city where there is, a brick factory, basically. So all of the earth would have been dug out of the riverbed, and each individual brick would have been handmade. And fast forward to the early 2000s, when they moved this house over to Ireland, they reassembled it. They numbered each brick and they reassembled it exactly as it stood in Tennessee. But a couple of the bricks had little marks or indentations in them, and they took them out for preservation, but they were sitting in an archive box essentially, and Liam showed them to us, and we assumed that they'd have handprints of an adult who was involved in making the house, but there's a handprint of a child and a footprint of a child who was just in the location where the bricks would have been drying at the time. It's in the 1840s, but looking further into the history of the house, there was no children belonging to the family of the house there at the time, so it's pretty safe to assume that this was an enslaved child, either involved in the building of this house or just present on the plantation at the time. So it's a really dark history, but at the same time, this work is about uncovering and telling histories of Ireland and Irish complicity in systems of racism and systems of colonialism that we don't always talk about or we don't always tell. And in America, I think people are quite comfortable with confronting those histories. Some people are comfortable with confronting those histories, but in Ireland we don't always tell those stories about ourselves. So this felt like those hand and footprints, they're like relics to us. It's like they've come, it's just such a coincidental series of events that brought them here to Ireland to kind of reveal themselves in a museum context. So we showed them at an exhibition last year, and now they're on permanent display at the Ulster American Folk Park. And it's just a kind of incredible piece of history to see a maker's mark like that in the brick. I think they're really powerful museum objects, and it was brilliant for us to get to work with Liam on, showing them to the public basically, and to get his expertise on the house and how it would have been built and how it would have been brought over, and that kind of conservation is something that we're really interested in terms of storytelling. How does a museum tell the story of Ireland and the Irish in America? How I would hope viewers would see and take in the work at Galway City Museum would be in the context of this beautiful exhibition that Michelle's put together. So it's a huge privilege for us to get to show amongst our peers and amongst so many other artists who are dealing with these really urgent topics. So that the works aren't just in isolation, they get this privileged position of being amongst the museum objects and inserting a different narrative. So, you know, some folk stories, stories of community action are in there in our video works, and then they get to sit beside like museum objects that might have been in the collection for 100 years. So that's, I think the context is really special to get to talk about storytelling in a museum context where, you know, this is where we tell the story of our history. So it's just a really charged space, and I think museums can be, you know, there can be tension in a museum as well in terms of like how do you represent the truth accurately. So the video works we have are people's specific story, like from their own perspective, from their own experience. Each story contains not just someone's like individual interpretation of what they saw, but like, you know, I might have seen something in the sky. I saw an apparition in the sky. This is one of the stories. But I know I saw it because my friend saw it too. Or for a second story, there's this a set of 13 skulls that were, they weren't buried, they were in a sort of an ossuary on Inishbofin Island. So they were out in an old chapel on the island, and they were stolen by Trinity College researchers who were practicing craniology on people in the west of Ireland, which is a totally debunked scientific practice, but they were trying to find this sort of like, what is this like quintessential like indigenous Irish, I guess, ethnicity. Again, it's totally debunked, but at the time, and you can see it, at the time people collected skulls and these were taken and they were written about in a diary as stolen, and they were brought to Trinity College where they were living in the old anatomy department for 133 years, and the people on the island, in particular Marie Coyne, who we got to speak to, launched a decade-long campaign to bring them back, and they brought them back last year and buried them. So it's really special again for that work and for Marie's story to be shown here in a museum context in Galway. It's the Galway story essentially, and it's a West of Ireland story.
It's time to return the skulls to their chosen place of rest. May they rest in peace soon.
For me and Ruth, participating in TULCA is just a really exciting and special time because we get to exhibit alongside so many other artists that we wouldn't normally be exhibiting at, you know, in the same context as. So a really nice example is Shani Barnes' Beautiful Sticks. You know, Shani is such a beautiful storyteller, and there's other artists like John Carson and Michael Holly who are incredible storytellers with their own mediums. So whether it's performance or video, everyone has their own approach to the medium and to the question of the environment, but also like how much our culture is connected to the environment.